Hi guys, it's Emily here with Bugaboo's Craft Corner, and today we are going to start a tutorial on how to make a peekaboo wood grain bee cup. So these are some of the products that I used, and I will link them in the description below. So first I started off by mixing my epoxy, and I'm using the CCDIY fast set. And I'm doing the epoxy method to put my glitter on, so I want to make sure that you don't use too much. So I only mixed 5 mLs, so 2.5 of each A and B, as it is equal parts. And you want to make sure that you mix it really well. I'm using the fast set as it dries faster. It has a faster dry time of between like 1 to 2 hours. So this is really nice when doing glitter, and you don't need a lot because you don't want to saturate your cup. If you saturate your cup in epoxy and you add glitter, you could end up with some wet spots as they are as it soaks into the epoxy, and you'll have too much epoxy versus glitter, so then that's how you get those weird white spots or wet spots. So you want just enough to get your epoxy or get your cup sticky. So right here I have already spray painted my cup a light pink because we're using Unicorn by Bugaboo's Craft Corner, and it is like a rose gold pink. And I know I have some spots that are a little funky on my cup, and that is okay because we're covering it in glitter. Now if you weren't going to use glitter and you were just going to spray paint it, I would make sure to do a better job than I did, because you will see that under the epoxy. Whereas since we're putting on the glitter, you won't see that. So right now I'm just mixing up my epoxy, and I'm going to start putting it on my cup. Again, I used Unicorn by Bugaboo's Craft Corner. It is a fine rose gold pink. And we're doing not the traditional bee cup, as my bees that you'll see later on in the video are pink and white. So I wanted to do a pink background instead of the traditional yellow or gold that you normally see when it comes to these. So I am just putting a thin coat of epoxy on my cup. So I just take my finger and I just run it across, up and down, and I make sure to get every crack and crevice of the cup, because you want to make sure that every spot does have epoxy on it, or your glitter obviously won't stick. So I'm just making sure to get all the sections even on the bottom, because I will glitter the bottom. As you'll see later, I like to put some of my decals on the bottom to make a peekaboo on the bottom too. If you don't want to have glitter on the bottom, you don't have to, and you don't have to put a decal on the bottom. It's just something that I like to do. So we're just putting enough epoxy on to make your glove ride gently over the cup, and it doesn't have like a sticking movement to it. It's just smooth. That's how you know you have epoxy all over your cup. And you don't need a lot. I don't end up using all 5 mLs, but trying to get equal parts of such a little bit can be kind of hard. And I just like to use the medicine cups that people get like for your normal medication to mix my epoxy in. So I did end up glittering another cup with that leftover epoxy, so none of it got wasted. And here we're going to pull out our glitter, and I do have a piece of paper underneath to catch my glitter that falls off, because a lot of it will fall off. And now you're just going to want to pour your glitter on until you have coated it to how you like it. Okay, and we're back. So I have already gone and put a coat of epoxy on my cup. So my cup is already smooth. I only had to use one flood coat of epoxy as I used a fine glitter. So I have a smooth surface. Now if you're going to use a chunky glitter, I would recommend using probably 2 layers of epoxy before putting on your decals. Just so that you have a smooth layer, because you will see all those bumps if you don't get them sanded out, or if it's not smooth when you put your spray paint on, which we will get to. So right now I cut out some honeycomb on my Cricut design space, and I just did a couple bunches, and I wanted one bigger section. So right here I'm taking all of the honeycombs and I'm gonna put them onto my cup, but later on I just kind of put my transfer tape down and I lift up, and whatever comes up, and that's how I do my bee cups. You can put as little or as many honeycombs on as you want. It's up to you. I did a few more than I normally would because I decided against putting a decal on this cup, as there's a lot that's going to be happening between the peekaboo, the drips, and having a 3D aspect with our little bumblebees. And when you're doing the honeycombs, to have a what would be considered a perfect honeycomb shape is that you want to have having the point facing upwards instead of the flat side. So that is what I'm doing here, and you can put them anywhere you want. It's totally up to you. You can do as many or as little as you want. So I'm going to fast forward through this so you don't have to watch me laying them all down, as it can be kind of tedious. I do put some of my honeycomb on the bottom of my cup, which you will see too, and I just tried to line that up the best I can. It's not going to be perfect, but it's the bottom of the cup, but it's just something little extra that I like to do on my cups if I can make it work into the design of the cup. And we are back. So I have spray painted my cup white already. And I just did a thin coat as we are going to wood grain it, as you can see. So I'm just taking a brush, and I'm just laying my alcohol ink on a line, and I'm just taking the brush and going back and forth and up and down. And I'm using an alcohol ink called Fog. I do believe this is a brand that is no longer made, so just finding a gray alcohol ink that you like. And when you're working with alcohol inks, you can add more layers to get it to darken, and using the chip brush that I'm using is going to give you that better line of what makes it look like a wood grain. And I wanted to go with a gray instead of the typical brown, as I wanted it to be more of a rustic tumbler than the traditional wood. So I went with a gray wood grain look. There is a little spot on my cup where my chip brush did end up pulling my spray paint off, which is okay. I did go back later on, which I didn't video it, but I just took some acrylic white paint and I dabbed it on with my finger and I let it dry, and then I did the same process of putting my alcohol ink over it, and it wasn't perfect. You could still see it, but it's okay because I'm going to end up putting one of my 3D bees over top that spot, so you're not going to really see it in the end result, which is okay because sometimes when it comes to cups, if you have a mistake like that, it can be easily covered up with a decal and or a design, and you don't necessarily need to strip your cup and start over. And I wanted to apologize for the next couple parts. I didn't realize that I was out of frame when recording these, and to be fair, this is my first video, and I have learned a lot from this video for our next one, and I'm excited to do my next video. So I'm going to speed up through this, and we'll jump back in when we get to the drips of the cup. Okay, we're back. So now that my cup is fully wood grained, it's time to take the decals off. Now when I did my decals, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I did use a removable vinyl, and it is a yellow one. So it will be easier to see if you're going to be working with a darker spray paint. You want to make sure that your decals don't match your spray paint so that you can see them a little bit easier. I did use a thinner coat of paint so you can see them through the wood grain. But by using a removable vinyl, they are a lot easier to come up. As you can see, my tweezers just kind of slide right under, and I'm able to pull it up without any issues. Whereas if you used a permanent vinyl, it is a lot stickier as it's permanent, and you could potentially get some residue left over, like that sticky residue, and that is no fun to try and clean up, including when you're working with alcohol inks, because using acetone or alcohol to try and get that up out of your peekaboo could potentially ruin your design that you have created when using alcohol inks. So I just like to use a removable vinyl, and I tend to just get kind of like the colors that I normally don't use so that I don't feel bad for wasting it. And that is all for this part. So I'm going to fast forward through this and let you guys see how it's just me pulling them off. And you do want to make sure that you're careful while doing this, because you don't want to scratch your paint while you're doing this. But if you do, since we are using a 3DB on it, we can easily cover up those scratches. The next part is a little bit hard to see because, again, I didn't realize that I was out of frame, and I'm really sorry. So I'm going to try my best to explain how to do the drips while the video is playing, but I'll go a little more into depth since you won't be able to see it very well.
Castle in Washington. Just like driving through this town, the Victorian architecture, it just feels like Europe or Ireland, Scotland. Just the fog on the sea and the castle. You're gonna feel that there's a story to be told, the dark history associated with memories of castle. Memories of castle is built in 1892 and was built by Charles Eisenreich. He was Port Townsend's first elected mayor. He lived here with his wife, Kate Eisenreich, until she died in 1902, and he ended up dying in an asylum. Hi, how are you doing? I'm doing good, how are you? My name is Zach Bagans. I'm with the Ghost Adventures crew, and we're here to try to talk to ghosts. All right, maybe check in. Absolutely. Is this place haunted? It is really haunted. I stay here a lot at night by myself. And I'm one who gets up and I investigate any noise I hear. And I can explain a lot of their way. I was an absolute non-believer until I was in the building by myself for about 3 days because it was really snowy outside. And so I had one of the housekeepers who lived a couple blocks up the road come down, and we were on 310. And we were making the bed and the door was open. I locked ourselves in because there was nobody down here at the front desk. And I went back to the door and I was just making the bed with her, and all of a sudden her face, she was just petrified. So I turned around like this, and I saw the body, this part of the body past the door, and I knew we were in there by ourselves. And I went out in the hallway, and I said, hey! And it was this lady, and she had a Victorian dress on, so you saw her past the door, you go out the door, and you still continue to see her. I full on looked at her, and when I yelled at her, she kind of looked at me like this. So she acknowledged your yeah. As I looked at her, I realized that I was looking at the fire escape through her. I could not explain her away. Well, the most interesting thing here is ghosts, they're spirits. Even though they don't have a living body with eardrums and everything like that, they can still hear me. This is why we're here at Memories of Castle, because these spirits are acknowledging the living. So you told us about the woman you saw walking down the hallway upstairs, right? Yeah. Is there any place in the castle that you had a terrifying experience? In the breakfast room. Why are you saying that? Well, this is weird and creepy. Now, why are you saying that this was your creepiest experience ever? I have been here for about 2 years. What's that?
Okay, so now that we're back, so I am going to tell you how I did my drips. So I'm using Mr. Nola's clear glass epoxy. I didn't want to use my fast set this time, as it does have a smaller working time frame than Mr. Nola's. So I am using a product called Nice and Thick by CCDIY, which I will link that in the bottom. I'll link all my materials that I use throughout this video. But the Nice and Thick is nice because you mix your epoxy like you normally would. So I mixed 20 mLs here of epoxy, and then I added in my alcohol ink, which I used a bronze color. So not quite a gold, but not quite a brown per se, and I wanted it to be more of a rustic drip than the traditional gold, because I felt like it would match better with the rose gold of the pink plus the pink of our 3D bees that we have. So I did that. The thing about using the nice and thick, you just add as many scoops as you really want to get your desired thickness of your epoxy. This makes it go by a lot faster than having to mix your epoxy and let it sit, because some of these epoxies do have a longer work time and you can end up being here for quite a while. So using the mix was very nice. The thing is, it is a white powder. You won't see it. It will turn your epoxy white. So if you're going to mix in a color, you may need to use a few more drops than you normally would, as it will dilute your color just a little bit. So I had to use an extra bit of color of my alcohol ink than I anticipated, but that's okay. But I didn't want it to be like a translucent gold. I wanted it to really shine, and so I made it darker than I wanted. And so for the drips, you're going to want to start off, you're not going to be able to see it really in the video, so I'm going to start talking about it now, even though it's a little bit later in our video. But hopefully by the time I get done talking about it, you'll be able to see it and we can fast forward through it, and then we'll get to putting the little bees on. So when you're doing your the epoxy drips, when you have it the thickness, if you're using the nice and thick, you want to start off by putting like a layer around, all the way around your rim, as like your base of your drips, and then you can go in, since this is a thicker epoxy, it doesn't run like you would if you were using just your regular epoxy and letting it sit and then putting it on. So this one, you'll just have to take your epoxy stick or your popsicle stick, whatever you use to mix your epoxy, and you're gonna create your drips by globbing it on your popsicle stick and then dragging it down your cup. And you can make your drips as long or as short as you want, or as fat or as skinny. It's totally up to you. It's just a drip. There's no rhyme or reason when it comes to drips. And they don't need to be evenly spaced. They don't need to be super long, super thick, short. It's just a drip on a cup, like candle wax spilling or honey dripping down your cup. Except for this is going to be a little bit thicker, so you're going to have more control of how long and how thick your drips are, which I liked personally compared to when I did my first drip cup. And since I did mess up this part a little bit with my camera and not being able to see it, I will make a tutorial on how to do a drip that you can see easily, and I will use the nice and thick again so you guys can see how I did it. But I just let it drip, and the nice thing about this is that I didn't have to babysit my cup, whereas if I didn't use the nice and thick, I probably would have had to use or to babysit it. So I only had to turn it upside down like once or twice. I did use a little bit of heat to get the epoxy moving again so that my drips would even out just a little bit, but I turned it upside down about twice in the course of 20 minutes, and then by the end of that, the drips were thick enough that they weren't moving, and I just sat my cup on the table and let it dry overnight, and that was the end of it. So that was super nice, not having to worry about babysitting the drips and not having to worry about if they're gonna run during the night was nice. So now we're gonna fast forward through all of this and we'll be right back. Okay guys, we're back. So now that my drips have dried, now you can see them a little bit better. I'm going to be adding our 3D bees. I am using a UV resin which hardens in UV light. So I do have my Sun Mini, which you can get off Amazon. I think it was like $3 or $4. Super cheap. And the UV resin is going to act like our glue for the bees. And that bee that is sitting right there on the cup that you can see is actually where I had my little spot that I had to touch up. And as you can see, the bee is covering it, so you're not going to be able to see it. And when it comes to putting these bees on, you can put as many or as little as you want on the cup. And I didn't do a decal on this cup, so I did a few more bees than I normally would have if I was going to do a decal. But I wanted to keep this cup a little more simpler without the decal and just let the design work of the peekaboo, of the drips, and of our 3D bees do the talking more than having a decal. So I did put a few extra bees. And we are going to be flipping our little bee over, and they're kind of like howled out, even though they're 3D. And I'm going to put epoxy into the little bum of the bee and on its wings a little bit. And then that way it will make kind of like a little pool for the bee to sit in. And then I just plop it onto the cup where I want it, and then I take my little Sun Mini and I do one round of the UV to get it to harden. So this is going to harden instantly, and you won't have to wait. You won't have any wait time as it hardens with the UV light. So I'm going to do 1 or 2 rounds of light on each bead to make sure that the epoxy does adhere and it does harden correctly. And then while putting the bees on, I kind of just put them in random spots that I thought may needed a little extra, or I thought a bee would look good there. So that's all that we do. So I'm going to cut my recording, and we're going to come back and when it's all finished. Okay, and now we're back. So now that our bees are on and they're all cured to the cup, I did go ahead and spray seal our alcohol inks in just so that they wouldn't run under the epoxy. I just used a clear matte spray paint. You can use any clear that you want. It doesn't have to be matte. That's just what I had on hand. And then once that dried, then I started to mix my epoxy. So this is a 22-ounce fatty. So I mixed 25 mLs of epoxy for the final coat, as we aren't putting a decal on, so this will be the final coat. And I just drizzle it on, and you're going to want to work around the bees. So first I just get the epoxy laid down, and your epoxy will pool around the 3D bees, so you're going to want to come back at the end, which you'll see that I do. And you just smooth it out and grab the extra epoxy that is around the bees. So I normally start with the bottom of my cup with getting that epoxied and getting that out of the way, and then I just pull my epoxy down, and then you're going to slightly go over your bees and up to the top. It's okay to go over the drips with the epoxy, and then you won't have like a weird line. And you can go over your bees too if you like. It's not going to hurt them. And you just want to make sure that you get your epoxy smoothed out, and it is a self-leveling epoxy, so it will self-level, but it's nice to try and get it smoothed out as much as possible, as well as making sure that you got all the little spots. And here I'm pulling some of the epoxy from the bees because there's a few spots that didn't get as much epoxy as I wanted, so I just stole it from around the bees as it started to pool. So then you're going to go back through and pull the epoxy. I do up and down motions, and I pulled from, sorry about my arm, and then I pulled around from the bees so that there wasn't too much pooling around them, because you will see that at the end. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't too noticeable, that there was going to be like a puddle of epoxy, and then this way I knew it was going to cure fine. And then I do hit my epoxy with a blowtorch to get rid of all of the little micro bubbles that might have come up. I didn't have too many, but just to be on the safe side, I did it anyways. Sometimes when I am doing popping bubbles, I like to wait like 15-20 minutes and just let it spin when I'm done messing with it. And this way, this gives it time for the epoxy to settle, and then the bubbles will rise to the top, and then that way I only have to hit the cup one time versus a couple times to try and get all the bubbles out. As when you wait, it gives it enough time. And then I just let this cure overnight and spin overnight. I always let mine spin overnight just because that's how it works. I normally craft at nighttime, and so they just spin overnight, and then it will be ready to go. And you can add your own decal if you want. You can add it before you add this epoxy if you want, or you can or you can add your decal, and then I would spray seal it and then add a small layer of epoxy again if you really wanted a decal on it, but I didn't this time. And here I am using my torch to pop those little bubbles, and then I just let it spin and I watch it. And when you are using your blowtorch, make sure to use that fast, swift motion, because if you let your heat sit in one spot too long, you can cause your epoxy to burn or seize, and that will cause little fish eyes, and then you'll end up having to sand your cup again and do another layer of epoxy that may not have been needed if you just kept moving with your fire. But that is the end of our tutorial, and I am so excited to see what you guys create. Thanks again. Bye.